5, 4, 3, 2, 1. As a CS student, I've never been more excited about the intersectionality between my education and these debates. It rarely happens. Okay, I'm first going to frame out what these language generating AIs are. Then I'm going to present two substantive claims. One will just be the general benefit we get, and the second will also serve as preemptive rebuttal, as well as illustrations of how this is likely to develop in the future. Okay, the framing. And I want you to understand that we're talking about a very specific subset of artificial intelligence. This isn't like Terminator AI that will take over the world sort of thing. This is a specific form of AI that simply generates text based on the input that the user gives. A very good example of this is GitHub Copilot, a recent artificial intelligence extension that came out for coders. The way it works is you give a particular sentence. I want a piece of code that does X, Y, Z, and it's going to generate a couple of lines of code based on the input that it's received. It's not like it's just going to randomly start creating pieces of code and publishing them randomly. It works in a specific unison and complementary to particularly creative coders, where it eases the sort of menial tasks that usually go into coding. So coming up with what you want to code is still up to the developer, but the actual process of writing it all down is something that is significant. The time for that is significantly diminished. The point at which these sorts of artificial generating texts are diminished. Like similar examples can be applied to other sort of industries where it is used. I want to give some more specific framings as to how these things are developed and how they are improved. Then I'm going to get into the argumentation. So the way most language generating AI are developed, a good example again is GPT-3, the most modern version of it, is that it takes billions of data points from all across the world. And when it's want to be used for a specific industry, it takes all billions or as many as possible data points for a specific industry. So when the coding example, it's going to like go through all instances of publicly available code as part of its like artificial intelligence learning. The second piece of framing over here is that after this training is done, it is tested against other data points before it is ever even released to the public. So once the training is done on all those billions of data points, new data points are generated and given to the AI, and it's tested as to how it is going to develop. Thirdly, there are usually beta periods in which certain people have access to it and test it out even further. So there's a lot of refinement going on over here. But even in the cases when it's fully developed in the far future, somewhere across the line, it's not published automatically. It doesn't have publishing rights. So there's obviously going to be a review period after some pieces of text has been generated by the individuals in charge to make sure that whatever is generated is like something that is worth publishing. The essential thing it does is just like, save time in writing stuff. Okay, two substantive claims from opening government. The first is that this technology is just generally beneficial, and the second will be why it's going to be done in a good way. First, the general benefit. And I want you to note the nature of this sort of technology is such that it just increases the productivity of individuals, and I think this is a good thing on two fronts. One, because it makes like the amount of time you have to type things out much lesser, and you can just give instructions to the AI to do that typing part for you. So the first sort of benefit is, I think, to the consumer. The point at which the manual labor is less costly to do for these sorts of things, I think that is the point at which things become a lot cheaper for individuals. The second layer, the second thing over here is just for the people who are working on these particular sorts of things. So for example, a news author does not now have to spend hours and hours grueling through like a 3,000 word manuscript and like editing it all out. It can just give the major points of what it wants to discuss in the article, give some facts or supporting facts that it wants to include it as well, and that thing is automatically made for them. So I think the productivity and ease of use is just increased in general for everyone involved. But the second benefit I want to argue over here is that it's a very unique sort of benefit on our side of the house for people with perhaps difficulty in writing. So for instance, people with ADHD or dyslexia who find it very difficult to sit on a computer or wherever they need to write things for many long periods of time, but are still very creative individuals who have a lot of ideas that they want to share. I think the development of these sorts of AI is uniquely beneficial for them because it removes one of the strongest barriers that they have from communicating textually with other individuals. And I think in a world in which more and more people are consuming media and all information through text online or through scripts and videos, I think this is a massive benefit in terms of accessibility for these particular individuals. Thirdly, I think it's going to lead to new developments in languages and linguistics and these sorts of ideas that are presented in certain fields. And a parallel to this is perhaps chess. When chess artificial intelligence became a really big thing, like AlphaZero and Stockfish, and like it went into very deep analysis of chess positions, there were a lot of new findings into the ways that chess could be played, new strategic elements as to how you could play chess. I think the reason for that is the ways that artificial intelligence and computing power is able to like just explore different options and different ways to write things. I think that just naturally leads to more possibilities, and some of them often tend to stick. We think that's a general good thing. All of these benefits are exclusive to our side of the house. I'll take a POI from CEO before telling you why it'll be done well. CEO.
So why do people communicating with ADHD better matter when it's not really you communicating because it's the AI that's writing what you're trying to say anyways?
No, that's the issue with that sort of POI. Like the idea still comes from you. Like if you were to leave an AI like on its own, it can come up with any number of texts in any in any field. So for instance, if it's a debating AI, it would come up with multiple ideas for like any number of motions. It is you, the individual, who says that this is the particular motion I want certain text for. If this is the particular argument, like you just give the headline of the argument, the generative text produces the argument for you. So the creative element is still largely your thing, but it is just the menial task of writing all that thing down that has become accessible, that becomes easy. So if you want to run some principal argument about human interaction, that still takes place. It's like, why would I want to talk on the phone? That's not me talking to another individual. It just makes it easier for us to, communicate on this level. The second thing I want to talk about is just why it's going to be done well. This will also serve as preemption. So I think a couple of things the opposition might say that this might be bad is perhaps the racism, some sort of racist remarks might be made, or that there might be mass scale unemployment or something along those lines. The unemployment thing, I just want to mitigate that this is just one particular subset of AI, not automation in general. But anyways, let's deal with the racism part first. Like this is probably one of the things that might make it a bad thing. Two things I want to note over here. The first, there were going to be quality checks with the sort of content that you produce. So if a newsroom, so it's not like a newsroom is accidentally going to post something, or like some social media manager is going to post something really, really bad or freaky. The point at which it's going to generate some sort of text, but there's obviously going to be a review period. I think the review period is much easier to go through once the bulk of the writing is done, and you just have to make sure that it's not like obscenely bad. But the second thing, I think it is much easier for correct for these biases on our side of the house, because notice on op side of the house, when you don't support the rise of this, or like you want to mitigate the rise of this, or something like that, then you're going to be relying on human writers to write these sorts of things. So I think it is far more difficult for you to curb human biases as opposed to artificial intelligence biases, because those things can be refined very easily and very quickly, just because that's how computing works. So that's why I think racism is an unlikely negative impact on our side, and it's probably something that can be very easily curtailed. The second thing is unemployment. They might say that, oh, people are going to lose jobs. I want you to note the key difference over here is that we're making certain jobs easier to do, not like non-existent. So going back to the coding example, the generative text cannot make a fully functional software engine, piece of software that interacts with other pieces of software or new pieces of software that needs to be like catered to. Because this AI, by definition of how it is trained, does not know what new circumstances might arise in which it needs to be like modified. Human beings have the creativity to be able to manage that. It's so that this makes it much easier for them to do so in the first place and much more efficient. That is why it is unlikely that we're going to have unemployment. But even if that was not true, I think we can also support regulation into how this is dispatched. But by and large, we do support the rise for all the benefits I gave you. Propose.
So language generating AI is a robot which can, at occasion, be productive and good. But at the moment in which it trenches itself in creative industry, it becomes massively harmful. Before I move on to our substantive, just a piece of framing that's very important. We don't think that language generating AI is completely terrible and should never be used. We think that still basic functions are still fine. That is to say, use it to do some technical work, skim text or voice to text things, etc. Do math. Right? Do some kind of research. That is something that is still fine and we can still use it on both sides of the house. The problem is when it entrenches itself in creative industry, hence entrenches itself in what we read and what we believe and the way we think. So notably, most of the OG claims are also like on our side of the house, still in this debate, we can still use that. So three things coming from OO. Number one, why this is still error prone and why this is ridiculously bad. Notice, no matter how much you develop these things, right, still governments can't take this out of the debate. They're still going to be error prone. Notice they're already being heavily researched, but they still are error prone, right? I don't think that any gov team can say, but in the future there will be they won't be error prone anymore. I think on both sides of the house, they still have to agree with them being error prone, right? But the specific problem with that is the way it makes mistakes is not like how to get context, right? It's much more in making conclusions, right? That is to say that it cannot necessarily separate right from wrong, good from bad, etc. I think that is true for two reasons. Number one, it's harder to learn to teach the robot that, right? That is because there is no moral codex which you can actually teach it and tell it this is right and this is wrong. But even if you can, that doesn't necessarily mean that codex that you gave it is the right codex, right? And that is actually good and actually bad. But just look at those robots. I think, like if you research them online, you can actually see that they do make a lot of contextualized context mistakes, right? I think think that those are also the mistakes in creativity, right? Notice that nowadays when we use AI, those are for technical issues. We still think that is fine. But the problem is that these are the mistakes that they entrench in society once they become used as a general idea, right? The problem is that it learns from data that it's given. This is usually data written by white males, right? Or by the very least fed to them by the white males from tech fucking industry who live in the West Coast, right? This is also majoritarian stuff. So minority stuff is rather unlikely to go here, which means that that it's very likely that you will have like more majoritarian ideas, more majoritarian stuff, more white people stuff. Notice opening government on this says, but there's going to be quality check. Yes, but this quality check is going to be introduced by the very same people who introduced it to the information in the very first place. But secondly, right, it's like notably true that people have biases, but at least there's a lot of people who can hear other opinions. When these robots are the only thing that's actually in usage, this is the only kind of narrative that you start hearing, right? I also think that the problem is that it's indistinguishable from like human writing, etc., which that means it's much harder to call it out as a mistake, as something that is wrong, right? Notice that we think like it's the way it gets much smarter. So it's not like so the idea is that much harder to call it out, not only because it's indistinguishable, because people have this idea that this AI is ultimately smart and makes no mistake, right? Even if they know that it makes some kind of small technical mistakes that are very like in small percentages, they like generally think that most of the mistakes they don't necessarily make, which means that on comparative, then that means that those things are introduced within the society and people start believing they're true, or by the very least have no way to call them out because they're written by a fucking perfect robot. What is the comparative? I think you have a more diverse set of authors and ideas, which is much more likely to have less bias, because at the very least you have more of them, so we have more opinions. I think that the impact of this, it entrenches itself in media and the art and the way we generally learn, think, and read, which is necessarily problematic. So even if some of Gov's like impact stand, I think this is much more important. The second thing is this is this creates a much easier situation for governments, like especially some dictatorial governments or like governments in places like Eastern Europe, right, to overflow networks to generate their propaganda. I think that the comparative is you need to employ much more people to write, but you just generally can't write as much, right? Because you need money, you need resources, but you just technically can't make it all possible, right? I think that what happens when you introduce these things is Chinese Communist Party buying these robots, or Serbian party that's currently in the power, right, buying these robots, which means that it entrenches itself within the propaganda. It's able to overflow the internet with their propaganda without allowing anyone else to write shit, right? That is because A writes incredibly fast and so much, right? But also because it's believable and indistinguishable from human writing, which means that it's very hard to call it out and say this was robotic while the other thing was human, right? You don't necessarily know which is which, right? Which means that it's completely used to stifle the opposition in these places. Notice that that it overflows everything else, which means that you overflow every critical idea or opposition. Notice that this will happen in places like Serbia, where the opposition already has a lot less time on the media and forums, etc., which is very, very dangerous. Much more likely it's to be used in a coercive and terrible way by these governments in order to fix their positions. On a comparative, you have much more opposition and much more like media that's able to write and research stuff and actually put it on the internet, which is usually the only way to change in a lot of places, right? I'm going to talk about why this fucks a lot of jobs, but I want to talk about take a POI from CG prior to that.
White men are already dominating the world and holding almost all power structures in media research organizations in your world. How is your comparative not system still being led by the
You still have
privileged?
writers who talk about many different things, right? You still have them producing texts and shit you can read, which on a comparative means that you have less of that on your side of the house. This fucks jobs, right? It's easier just to get IA rather than humans, right? One, because it becomes cheaper, you produce it more, but number two, it's much more efficient, right? That is the problem, because then people start losing their jobs, right? But notice that these are the people who are unlikely to find other sorts of income. Why? Because they work in a creative industry in which all of that was all of the workplace was taken by a fucking robot, right? Which means that this is, even if you can get like some economical benefits, you still have a lot of people losing their jobs without the ability to find new ones, which I think is necessarily problematic. But this also means that you have power grab by the companies who produce this, because now they know that they provide a lot of goods and services, right? A little amount of them, like they're able to produce these things. It's like IBM and maybe one more, which which means that they monopolize the whole market of this, which means they're able like to utilize what it produces and how they develop their services, etc. Which means you have more monopoly on their side of the house. Even if they can prove some economic benefits, this is true. But notice that this is only good for companies, right? And if we can prove that a lot of people lose their fucking jobs, I think this is then more important. Because of these three very important reasons, and because you don't want governments to stifle the fucking opposition with this, please vote all.
One. I'm going to do three very simple things in my speech today. First, I'm going to reiterate what language generating AI actually is and what its progress is likely to look like in the future, because this is not some Terminator kind of thing that's going to be used and taken over by autocratic governments. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why this doesn't just not diminish human creativity, but actively adds to it and allows human creativity to flourish. And lastly, I'm just going to talk about the comparative benefits and harms in terms of in which world you have more error compared to less. Firstly, on the framing of this AI to begin with. This is a language generating AI that's used in conjunction with a lot of other things. So Danal already gives you extensive analysis on how, for example, it creates like the baseline production for you and thus creates a lot of ease in terms of productivity. But this is not the kind of AI that automates everything and is mostly like dedicated to doing certain tasks that are quite difficult or quite long or that take a lot of human energy to do. This already tells you that human creativity is like always going to exist and is always going to supersede here to begin with. But in order for this to make like more sense, I'm going to first explain why CEO's idea of originality or human creativity isn't that relevant or important or exclusive in this debate, and then move on to O's idea about how it doesn't get taken away. Anyways, firstly, understand that human creativity isn't eliminated because of things like quality checks that Daniel already tells you about. In terms of the fact that this data testing is being done across like millions of different points, but the idea that you input is like original to you to begin with, I don't think it gets any more like creative than the fact that you are the person who thought about this idea and it's entirely based on what you input. It's really important to understand that this is where the technology is right now on a second level, and it took like 20 to 30 years for the technology to get even to the point where it can generate like language at this pace. According to OO World, where it can generate like new kinds of language or new kinds of like phrasing and all of those things, I would posit that's going to take a significantly greater amount of time. And I don't think human beings are going to get to that level of technology to begin with, because what's important to understand about the framing of this is that it cannot and is not capable of like doing things that you don't necessarily input or doing things that are outside of its parameters to begin with, which means that the kind of technology that they're talking about that doesn't exist, they don't give you any structural analysis for why it's likely to exist or why it's so necessarily harmful, even if it does. The second claim that I'm going to deal with is this idea of error and biases that are likely to occur within this specific kind of AI and not others. A couple of really important responses here. Number one, notice that Danal gives you the analysis of how it's trained on like billions of different data points and it's comparing it to every single piece of data available. Like compared to human biases or even human ability to like human biases, subconscious or conscious, or even human ability to like track through that much degree of information or even consciously realize that they're being biased, I would posit that AI is just significantly less biased. But secondly, our idea of quality control wasn't that, necessarily that these companies aren't going to be run by white men because they're going to be run by rich white men on both sides of the house. It was that in order for corporations to make a profit, or in order for us to live in the kind of universe that O wants us to imagine, where this technology is being used by every country or it's being used on a massive scale, it needs to sell. I don't know why corporations have the incentive to sell like technology that is extraordinarily error prone and that is extraordinarily racist to a lot of people, or how they can even get away with doing that to a lot of people to begin with. But the third thing here, which also clashes with their idea about how there will be no accountability. Notice their analysis for why there will be no accountability is literally that, oh, it's a robot. People can't criticize it. This is just not true, especially considering that you already have a lot of skepticism, or inherently human beings are like unsure or unfamiliar with how to deal with AI because it's something that is not human or not something that human beings have previously interacted with to that degree. So the likelihood for there to be skepticism, or the likelihood for this to be like the most important or disgusting within the media or within national discourse or national dialogue, is incredibly high. I would posit the ability for you to critique AI and for you to get the matter fixed is significantly greater than when you're meant to be arguing with people on TV shows about whether that person was actually racist or that person was actually not racist. But fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, Daniel also gives you this reason in terms of preemption. It is significantly easier for you to be able to track down racism or track down biases or errors within AI because there are patterns and there are data sets. It is significantly harder to either find out about those things because they're done in like usually really subtle, covert manners by human beings, but also to quantify them and thus to be able to deal with them. Before I move on, CEO.
Yeah, so writing doesn't actually take that much time. Good writers can crank out thousands of words in a single week. Where is the biggest impact of your case? We'd suggest that the biggest impact is that people are taking a lot of time to develop ideas. And so therefore you have to defend AI, which comes up with ideas itself in many instances.
That I don't understand what that POI means, because that's the entire point. This AI is like a tool much similar to a lot of other technologies that have existed in the past that allows human beings to largely increase their efficiency, productivity. And it's like a transmission method for human beings to be able to actualize a lot of their ideas. This also ignores all of Dana's analysis about neurodivergent individuals, or literally a very large sector of individuals for whom these tasks are quite difficult and like their creativity is hindered through these tasks. So I don't really understand what that POI is about. But also in terms of like this argument about originality or creativity or that being taken away, first of all, I don't think anything is original. Like, we live in a world where algorithms will literally decide our day-to-day moods, or will literally decide the information we consume, even in terms of social media. So I don't think that argument is exclusive to this particular kind of AI at all. That kind of AI already fucking exists. But secondly, Daniel also gives you an extended argument on how the point at which you have this kind of technology interacting with human beings, or the point at which you can come to the point where AI can possibly add to that particular field, like he gave you examples of chess. That is the point where you can take human creativity, you can take the baseline ideas, which are always going to be original to human beings, to their thoughts, their experiences, their personal moral calculuses, etc. And you can find new and interesting ways to either transfer them quicker or transfer them in a more effective, like more interesting manner. So the endpoint of like human actualization, or the extent to which human beings can really express themselves within different fields, is best expressed the point at which you do have this intersectionality present within the AI. Because we tell you that on our side of the house, you have significantly lesser error than human beings, and O is not very relevant in this debate. And we tell you how this allows for the progression of human flourishing and creativity, like much other AI existing in the modern day, existing right now. Give it to OG.
Hi, hope you can hear me or see me. Look, I think we can have a very boring debate about like whether in short term the creativity and human involvement will be like very present when we deal with the like language generated AI. Because I do think that if a debate is on a short-term basis, then OG kind of always wins, right? Because I do believe to some extent they're right to point out that like creativity, human involvement is still something which is necessary. And we to that say that's completely okay. However, I think debate should be led in a like much bigger terms, right? And I do believe that the biggest harms and also like the biggest benefit of this technology will come today, but 20 or 30 years like on so. And I do believe there are huge incentives to actively develop this technology and to use it a lot, right? Because I think number one, there's a huge money to be made here, right? It means that a lot of companies have an incentive to actually push and develop these areas. But second of all, I do believe to some extent there's a huge prestige in actively being involved in like discovering something in the sphere of AI, meaning a lot of people are involved, meaning certain progresses are going to be made, right? And I don't think that opening a government can actually stand and say that the biggest like benefits of this will not come today, right? Like we say, yeah, probably not today, but it will in the future, right? I think that's the moment in which like a lot of our harms are actually gonna materialize, right? Because in the moment in which you can use like AI for shit ton of stuff that today we use humans, right? I think like that's the moment in which a lot of employers are just gonna realize that humans are a hassle, right? Employing them means number one, huge amount of money that you give to them. And second of all, like you need to deal with very productive, very often they need fucking vacations, they very often they need to go on a sick leave, right? Meaning this is the moment in which a ton of employers around the world are going to realize that it's far better for them to actively employ this AI. And this is important for two very crucial ideas. Firstly, as George pointed out and kind of opening government completely ignored, this means that you are going to have huge power grab by a small group of corporations who are going to be able to sell or to rent this AI to a lot of other companies, right? Meaning all of the gains that you're going to get in productivity from this are going to be pushed into specific areas and into the hands of the richest in the world, right? I think today, in the moment in which like the creative industry isn't still something which you can like automate, right? The gains are far more dispersed, meaning a lot more people can actually assess them. Secondly, and I do believe to some extent like this is very important, right? As George pointed out, like very often, even if you have huge gains in productivity, this isn't something which is inherently good in the moment in which shit ton of people are going to lose jobs, right? Because that's the moment in which they do not have the purpose in life, right? Very often our work is something which like determines our self-value, meaning even if maybe you get like more gains in productivity overall, right? I don't think that it can override the harm of huge amount of like people actually losing their jobs. But three, I think that the creativity and all of the stuff that you're gonna get isn't actually gonna be good, right? And I do think this is somewhere where I'm gonna extend, right? Because I think like this AI learns only from what was already created, right? It means that it uses only known elements from all of the texts that are there, right? And I think this has huge impact on what is actually being produced, right? Meaning that the stuff that is going to produce in creativity, right? It's always going to be similar to what was already there, right? It's going to be always a variation of theme, but it's not going to be something which is groundbreaking and actually shakes the ground and moves the art or like whatever else you want to call it, right? That's why I do believe this is a huge harm. Even if maybe this like comes with like raising productivity, right? The outcome that you're going to get is going to be far worse. And I do believe to some extent, this should be very, very important, right? The response that they give to our idea that like this is going to entrench like racism and a lot of other ideas because this AI is very often worse and extremely bad when it needs to conclude, they say that content is seen and checked by other people. I have three responses on this. Number one, I think very often what's going to happen is, yeah, maybe we check it today. However, I think 10 or like 15 years down the line, right, people are going to become far more reliant on technology, meaning they're going to give it far more trust, right? And even in the status quo, right, we presume very often that AI is more accurate than a human can be, even though we know that some mistakes can be made, but because of our fallacy of thinking that humans are almost always far more wrong than an AI can be, it means there is far less incentive to check it. Secondly, I do think there is a huge incentives by companies to actively hide mistakes for profit, because if they're able to hide mistakes, they're able to sell this AI to other companies for far bigger profit, meaning you're actually going to get the suppression of any talk about the mistakes that these machines very often make. Three, I do believe to some extent humans are more accountable, even if they're more error prone, right? Because notice that very often when an AI is actually mistaking or racist, there is no one to actually call out, because everyone can hide away and say that, oh, but I built just a specific part of the software, or I just wrote like a specific part of the code. Who the fuck knows what the AI wrote on the internet, or like what they actually read on the internet, right? Meaning everyone can shrug off the accountability. When a human is mistaken, it's very harder to do that, right? Because you have like one person who actually fucked up, right? And I do believe to some extent this is very, very important. Before it, I want to take closing.
So at worst, you argue a handful of companies in your world will have a lot of power. Why won't these companies use the expanded capacity they have to look at multiple different billion data points and channel that into things like, for example, research for cancer, which is still good?
Okay, no, because I'll try to point out very often the majority of data these AI can actually get is something which is being primarily focused on the majoritarian group, right? Meaning the access that they get to data is something which is limited in the first place, right? I think the response that we do get from CEO is that, oh, but like the richest and like the biggest corporations have already been conquering the world, right? I do believe to some extent this is true. However, number one, they're far easier to call out, right? And number two, they're still a far more diverse group, and this is something which is very important. I just want to point out that that OG never responded to the idea that George pointed out that it actively means that it's far easier to spread propaganda and fake news, right? Because as George pointed out, even though this is something which is done in the status quo, it's much harder to actively do it, right? Number one, it takes far more time because you actively need to do it manually. Secondly, if you automate it and give it to a bot, right, people very often see that a text is written by a bot, right? That's not something that you actually see when you have like an AI generating language who is very often indistinguishable from human, right? Even if maybe this is something that isn't possible today, it will be very soon, right? Meaning this is the moment in which you can actually flood the news with like fake news and propaganda. And this is the moment in which I don't think like only like authoritarian governments, but also like a lot of other benevolent actors who actively want to, for example, like influence elections and all of that, right? I do believe to some extent this is something which is very important. Finally, on the idea that this is something which is helping people who have like disabilities, right? As George pointed out, we aren't opposed to like to AI, which can generate language in the abstract, right? That's something which exists in the status quo, right? And we think that like voice to text, like idea, for example, that you can say something and that can be translated into a text, right? That's something which isn't in the debate, right? That's just like the existence of AI. That's like their lowest function that they can actually have, right? This debate is about a much bigger like scope of functionality that they actually can have. So I do believe to some extent the idea of like accessibility is something which is kind of out of the debate. Very proud to oppose.
For POIs, please use the chat. About two things in this speech. Firstly, about how you're less likely to get criticism of existing industries, and then secondly, talking about why this is likely to reduce competition in key corporate sectors. On to the first thing about criticism of existing industries. Opening opposition makes the argument that the problem is that we are largely working off of biased data. This is mitigated by a couple of things, and there are two key problems. Number one, GovBench points out that there's already privileged actors and old men who are producing these things, so it's unclear why the algorithm of the human mind that's also often biased is any better. But secondly, we're just going to outframe by our case not being hung on like racial kinds of biases and biases of data, but other kinds of biases about why human interaction and thought is much better. I'm going to make two observations under this argument. The first thing to say is that we are less likely to get critical thinking in new conclusions that are being formulated. And this is likely to directly clash with what we hear against the MG. This is not about whether the tech itself is hard to criticize or not, but rather the fundamental way that our brains are able to form ideas. The problem that exists with technology is that it is always beholden to conclusions that already exist on the internet. Therefore, you're not engaging in any kind of critical or introspection process over ideas that exist, but rather you are using some kind of raw algorithmic formula about given the information that exists, what is the way that I'm able to form a conclusion from that information? On the comparative, while humans are pulling things like text together, our minds are not stagnant and blank while we're engaging in research processes, but rather when we're going through old information, we are often asking ourselves if it makes sense in a variety of ways. So for example, if you are reading two different distinct studies that have entirely different end goals over any kind of like medical information, you often ask yourself, given that like research processes were quite equivalent across these two studies, what were responsible for such like different outcomes that existed at the end of the day. And then what you end up doing is that when you see that there's often these disparities in data, you start criticizing older outcomes to a much larger extent. So I think that, for example, like battery technology traditionally focused on certain kinds of metals, but then innovators, through criticism of previous studies, had the idea to use lithium despite it being much lighter weight, because they thought that it could make better batteries. And I want to note that even if innovations that we have while we're engaging in research processes are not 100% correct, it often causes augmentations to existing theories. So there's certain innovations in hydrogen cells that we had thoughts on were not effective in themselves, but then became important in sparking forms of innovation into the future to a much larger extent. On the comparative, machine algorithms are not criticizing, but rather they're more likely to resort to things like majoritarianism and credibility. And this is a response to the closing government extension over how right now people are biased with how they research. I have two responses to this. The first thing to say is that algorithms need to distinguish between credibility in some kind of way. It is impossible to formulate a study using like 2,000 articles that exist because you need an endpoint of the conclusion that you're ultimately formulating. Therefore, when Microsoft and IBM are designing these machines, you often have to resort to the metric like the most popular thing in Google is going to be given the most weight because you need some kind of way to decipher between different informations because you're not criticizing scientific processes themselves. But number two, I think that humans under our side of the house do have an incentive to seek out new kinds of information. This is because your thesis is literally not allowed to be like the same as anyone else's. And the best way to get featured into a scientific journal and to better your own legacy is to be that individual who had a breakthrough conclusion. And I want to know that the reason that you can get criticism is not what opening opposition says of like people are not doing that, but it's that if you criticize, you're often like correct. The machine fundamentally is correct because it's working off on old studies. The problem is that you need to criticize what those underlying studies are. The second observation that I want to make in this argument is that this is likely to have a crowding out effect where fewer humans go into these industries. This may at face value be similar to what OA says over how there's going to be more unemployment, but the end conclusion is very different. I think that fewer humans are going to go into these industries, it's going to be a lot harder for them to profit when machines are faster and when it's just harder to compete with the sheer mass of what's being produced. I also think that like news organizations and stuff have an incentive to cost cut and therefore stop paying people wages and therefore do all of these things. The problem is that there's likely to be a crowding out effect where you have fewer people going into things. The question then is, why are humans uniquely likely to shift thought within these industries substantially faster? The first thing to say is that humans die, whereas computers do not. We often get forms of generational change where humans have no idea because there's things like external patterns of how the world works, like the rise of social media that made people a lot more globally minded, which is why everything is not just being run by rich white men under the status quo. But secondly, and this is key, humans have more internal diversity of thought between one another. So rather than having a news company that's working on a similar algorithm, you often get things like different writers who come from different lived experiences, and therefore they can critique and debate one another. And at the very least, you have a news company who are producing a higher degree of ideas. I think that less stagnated industries is really important because you can, number one, identify more mistakes of the past, but number two, I think that we have a right to have the arraignment of corporate preferences aligning more to what current people actually think, because given that corporations have extreme control over our lives, I think that we have a reciprocal claim to be able to influence them to a larger extent. Before I continue, OG.
Yeah, this just produces text. The ideas still come from the people, so you can still criticize it or come up
I
with new
understand.
ideas. Why
There's
should
a,
this
okay,
idea
so the problem is the idea is not coming from the person. Like you can tell the computer what argument to write. The problem is the computer writes the argument from information that existed. When I write a debate argument, I'm thinking critically about the mechanisms that I actually want to use. Second major thing, why is corporate consolidation going to get a lot worse? Initial like creations of this tech are likely to be extremely expensive, making them exclusive. Number one, if Microsoft or IBM designs this, they're going to have an incentive to patent it, meaning that prices are going to be massive. And even if they're not formal kinds of patents, given that production costs and research costs are high, they're going to want to sell it at relatively high prices. Number two, if you buy the CG case, there's going to be backlash to like firing people. Larger companies are going to be more immune to this, where they can tolerate things like a temporary drop in their share prices because they have a larger capital buffer that ultimately exists. I mean, it's going to be easier for them to implement to a larger extent. Thirdly, if this happens through things like internal industry innovation rather than one company patenting it, although we probably agree with CG, it's going to take a lot of money to actually produce this and appropriate it to your industry, and you have no money to give it to your competitors. The question then is, why is this likely to be a tipping point relative to other kinds of forces that are promoting consolidation? So I want to note this is not about manufacturing, where like automation is going to probably happen anyways. I think it might be used in industries like science that they end up saying, where larger pharma companies are now going to have a much easier time trying to write research reports, or things like law, where case writing and sourcing is now going to be concentrated to larger companies. There's two different kinds of tipping points. Number one, reliance on human labor under the status quo serves as a massive kind of equalizer. You have to do things like pay people wages. There's a time differential which prop needs to access in order to get all of their ideas of efficiency, right? So this ends up being a huge, huge, huge differentiation. The second thing to say is that it becomes harder for smaller companies to be able to break into new industries when market research is now being done by these algorithms themselves, meaning that larger companies are always going to have an advantage to innovate to a much larger extent because the ideas that smaller companies would have are now more difficult to access. Even a small difference at first also becomes larger because of things like lobbying for antitrust and companies becoming too big to fail. Why do we want competition? Number one, it's bad for companies to become too big to fail because then you end up getting state capture where things like lobbying processes are easier. And it's also a lot worse during forms of financial crisis where if one company go under, effects are larger, but also they're going to be a lot more incentivized to engage in risky and irresponsible behavior when they're going to be bailed out. Two, this flips the opening government claim about prices to a larger extent. You have no incentive to keep prices lower if you're a monopoly. Three, there's less of an incentive to innovate because you're not competing against other kinds of people. And fourthly, this gives you outsized degree of political influence where you can become a key lobbying power and therefore dilute the voices of other people. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in CO.
Thank you.
When Project Debater debated against a certain human being who will not be named because they may or may not be in this room, they made a really, really brilliant case about how good primary education is. The problem was that that wasn't actually the debate. That was about pre-existing information they had. And the human debater that responded reframed the entirety of it. They discussed a different context in which they could spend that money on different things. This is what was incredibly important because it allowed the human to generate new thought process that previously did not exist. This is more important than opening opposition's mechanism to try and claim the same impact. Because open opposition claims that, well, it's really important to be able to have, not relying on old data that is often slanted. The problem with this was already pointed out by the government teams in two ways. First of all, you can obviously select certain amounts of data, as OG points out. But second of all, there is a wide breadth of data, as CG points out, that is continuing to be established, and therefore primary sources can provide new conclusions if that is the mechanisms that you agree with. Therefore, Naomi's extension was incredibly important on that point in particular, because we explained why there is a marginal tipping point in that it is about the thought process of humans in comparison to the thought process of a computer, that it was critical thinking about those new conclusions, that it wasn't necessarily even a rational process. You could take all of the pre-existing conclusions that had already existed. For example, in the 1950s and 60s, depression was understood as something that is just an intense form of sadness. However, this was eventually questioned in a very, very fairly irrational way to be more of an absence of emotion with particular receptors that were not accepted. And therefore, when we started to have that new idea, we then researched into that idea afterwards. You couldn't just say, well, we can do primary research into new sorts of fields, because you had to question the fields in the first instance. We would just be doing on proposition side primary research into the same sorts of fields that already existed. This points out why closing government's responses to our case are insufficient, because primary research, if you're just feeding it in back to the same algorithm, was not useful, but also outweighs opening opposition's mechanism for the same claim there. It also responds to opening government's claim, because opening government says that we get really, really good amounts of new research. The problem is, if that research is slanted in a way which is not actually useful for humanity, then who the fuck cares if we have thousands of more papers, if those papers don't do anything to do things like attempt to mitigate depression or provide new sorts of lithium batteries that wouldn't have existed if we just thought about the new and previously existing battery technology, which was about heavy batteries rather than light ones, right? So this suggests that we get huge benefits on the marginal change of that technology. And I want to point out, this was really, really important because one finding from mistake does genuinely impact every single person in a society. Because when one corporation starts to find something, others can reverse engineer that one thing, start to decrease the prices, and proliferate that to a vast majority of individuals within the society. So we get much more universal benefits than the other teams in the round. Secondly, I want to weigh in on sort of the top half clash here. Opening opposition says bad parties can entrench themselves through propaganda. Closing government gives a whole lot of responses to why this is kind of a ludicrous idea. I just want to add one more piece of mitigating factor here, in that probably they already have asymmetric power here. Right? They're probably just able to put stuff on the internet regardless. I just genuinely don't see what the marginal change of this round is. Opening government says you can access new human endpoints, for example, on chess. These are very different from chess AIs, where you input a new move and then they calculate based on what that move is. But the difference here is you are feeding in pre-existing information, whereas that is accessing new information. If they wanted to claim that they get new endpoints, then they couldn't run all of their mitigation of our case, because in every POI they respond, well, you are still the ones who are inputting the original information. But if they want to claim that you access new endpoints, then inputting that new information doesn't matter, because it's about how that black box edits that information through the process of argumentation. So they then had to agree that to some extent, and especially into the future, you're likely to get editing of that information as it goes in, and therefore less questioning of pre-existing research. Opening opposition says we love jobs. This is probably true, and there are probably a marginal change in the amount of jobs that exist. However, this is likely to decrease over time. And what that means is people can access different jobs, right? So if it's the case that this technology proliferates to a much larger degree over time, then people would stop going into writing if they perceive that was something that they wouldn't be able to access a job in. But secondly, I just want to point out, there aren't a ton of writers already. So surely opening opposition gets some marginal change here, but it's probably not the round-winning argument here. What was more important, however, is what those writers did, because it was a massive fixed cost for corporations to have to do things like hire writers in the status quo. Wage labor is one of the primary expenses that corporations had. And it was important because it was less likely that they did that. The harm wasn't that those people lost jobs because they would be able to get jobs in other sectors. The problem was that certain corporations now had a much greater ability to monopolize discussions, especially as corporations and initial investments are really, really high. So you need to spend loads of money on this technology at the start, especially as it is rising, because it is often prohibitively costly at the start when certain companies have monopoly over sale rights. This is important because competition genuinely did matter in this round. And it was so important that the CG whip did not engage with this extension. Firstly, because it kept prices lower. If you have a monopoly and people are going to do things anyway, there's an incentive to price hike. So this allows companies to do that under their side of the house. This also responds to OG's claim because costs on their side don't trickle down to the average consumer, because OG is like, well, you are able to decrease costs overall because we are paying writers less, and writers have to do less writing, so there's less cost here. But the corporation still controls what the price is. So in the instance that they have a certain monopolistic power and ability to shape the prices still, when consumers have expected a certain price over history, they're still able to give certain prices. I'll respond to OG and then get on to CG later. OG, yeah, go for it, sorry.
Yeah, you said there's a natural limit to these AIs. Doesn't this prove the point that human creativity will always be needed, and thus it won't take over the ability to critique or be creative?
Your whole case is that you're going to massively decrease the cost of doing all of these things. If it decreases the cost, then corporations are likely to shift in a way which doesn't maximize future research. Sorry, I didn't mean take a POI from CG in the future. I meant respond to CG's extension in the future. In a way that massively decreases fixed costs. It's unlikely that they actually do want to continue to engage in that research. But also, OG's case is premised on there still being edits that exist afterwards. But if you are only paying someone to edit, either A, you're going to massively decrease the amount of people you pay because you need less people on that. But more likely, you're just going to not have those sorts of edits because it's so costly to pay someone to just look over a paper. You're just likely to let it continue. Finally, getting on to closing government. Now, they say, it's very hard to start new things. You often consolidate on old information. Firstly, this is likely to be a majoritarian system in a way which is bad. It wasn't just it was likely to be a majoritarian system, because you literally can't, in a 10-page paper, get literally every piece of information. So clearly there is some selection bias with their information selecting system. It is more likely on their side when the input is literally just what this AI finds that it's likely to be majoritarian. Whereas if an individual genuinely wanted to find information from, for example, a queer writer, they would be able to do so on our side of the house. But genuinely, if there is someone who wants info from a queer writer, and they would have to put that within the algorithm, i.e. select the algorithm to find that. If that person wants to do that, they would just search out queer writers in the first place already. So they would find the Oxford article written by X person, right? They would already do that under either side of the house. It seems like there's a very, very marginal change in this. But finally, you often don't want to make the most common argument when you're writing new. This is what Naomi told you and they didn't respond to in WIP, right? You want to have new argumentation so that you can, make money as a researcher. For those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much.